It's an honor to stand up for my father on this occasion. I owe him so much for my happy life. He's a role model, a man of cultivated moral character, deliberate about the way he conducted his life. He literally wrote the book. But I'm aware that he also seasoned my life with joyful things that impact me every day. From how he processed thought, to his sense of humor, from his sense of style, to the teams that we root for. Underdogs, of course. The smell of the ocean. An appreciation of language. In the latter stages, he dropped the intensity. And we saw a new level of gratitude and kindness that ultimately might have been the best modeling. So today we'll take a few minutes to appreciate him and how he lived, and we thank you for joining us for that.
Oft I sing for my friends when death's cold hand I
No.
I can't see either way. Dad loved NC State University. Really, he loved university life in general. He believed in public education. His father was principal of South River High School, which I think to Dad made him the most important person in South River, New Jersey. I remember Dad talking about his father presiding over the high school graduation. He would call out the names of the graduates, lots of Polish and Eastern European names, and he would pronounce each one perfectly without a hitch. I liked how much my dad admired his father. It seemed perfectly natural to me. When Dad was still in school, he and Mom visited a friend who had a faculty position. As Dad would tell it, they sat at the breakfast table till about 10 o'clock. The friend finally said, "I need to go teach a class, but I don't have any office hours, so I'll be back and take you around the campus at lunchtime." This, he decided, was the job for him. Dad was a natural for university life. He was an intellectual and he loved smart people. He was an English major as an undergraduate and a beautiful writer and speaker. Dad's oldest living friend is Peter Joanides, and Mom still corresponds with him. His health kept him away today, but he wrote this to Mom. Bob Bryan, a man of sterling character and intellect, and one of my oldest and dearest and treasured friends, who first introduced me to Thomas Wolfe, my literary alter ego, who always gave me invaluable advice about my own writing, and once spent 3 whole days in a mountain fastness near Asheville helping me correct and edit and proofread a horrendous 3-volume work, who is a purist about language and would brook no slippage from his exacting standards, who is a man who would answer the query of who had knocked on the door by saying, "It is I," and if he were with Geraldine, then it is we. Dad was a gifted teacher. His first faculty job was at a small school in northwestern Pennsylvania called Thiel College. In 1961, the year I was born, the students at Thiel dedicated the yearbook to him, writing, "Word on campus recently has been that a student hasn't really lived or learned unless he has taken a Dr. Bryan course." In a file of Dad's treasured letters was an email from a former student at State, Dale Litchblow. "One of these days I will have to tell you how many times, after hearing and reading about all the political, economic, and ethical corruption and untoward behavior that goes on here in D.C. and in the U.S. and around the world, just how often I give thanks to you for those astute, ethical, moral lessons I learned when I assisted you at a large intro to philosophy class my senior year. Virtue is excellence in the performance of function. Happiness is good form over a lifetime, bringing it off, going over the high bar in perfect form. But you can't be happy on the rack. How pleasure is just the bloom of the rose. Paul Newman's lack of character at the beginning of The Hustler, and how it was regained at the end, and so again, after he took his shot, I don't even have to look if it's going in. And of course, the Republic and Socrates. Lessons about doing what's right for the sake of the soul. How many times have I read about political and economic corruption and thought to myself, there but for a truly great teacher, Dr. Bryan, go I. Uncountable. Thank you. I took a class from Dad. He taught me ethics. Really, Dad taught me ethics my whole life, but one spring I got college credit. The man was old school. He wore a coat and tie to class, which was not common even in 1980. He called us all by our last names, so I was Mr. Bryan. I'm not sure the class ever caught on. Sometimes at the bell, he would put a trash can in front of the door so that late arrivals would make a racket. That was kind of mean, but Dad did not believe in missing kickoff. I remember him describing what it meant to be a human being from a moral perspective, and how a human was different from a crimson-bottomed orangutan or a rhododendron. Dad had a comic's ear for the specific. What rights does a rhododendron have? Dad spent a couple of classes on a desert island where one of us would land and then others to give us insights about constructing a society. To this day, when I think about the world and right and wrong, I often go back to Dad's desert island. But Dad loved NC State University. The great project of his professional life was building what he determined to be the finest philosophy department, the finest undergraduate philosophy department in the country. When he got here in 1966, NC State had only been called North Carolina State University for 1 year. People in the community still called us State College. Dad hated the State College smokestack on campus, but I love it. It reminds me where we were and where we are now. The philosophy department's top course was marriage and family life. There was no degree in philosophy or in religious studies, but Dad could see what was possible. He lured some fantastic scholars and teachers to the department. He used to say that he could never have gotten a job in the department as it had become. And he knew how to treat his people. Another treasure in his folder was a letter from Jim Moorhead, a religious studies professor, who was leaving because he had been offered a chair at Princeton. It read in part, "I want to express my personal appreciation to you. Bob, I could pour out superlatives in praise of your leadership, and every adjective would be true. During your tenure, you have created one of the nation's best undergraduate departments in philosophy and religion. What's more, you have set a tone of fairness and collegiality rare in any department in any university. I have appreciated your friendship and support of my work more than I can say." As you can imagine, this was all very impressive to the little boy at the dinner table. I was amazed as he described his work and impressed it with the people he knew. He was friends with Chancellor Caldwell and had had the man in his house. But even more impressive was that he knew Jim Valvano. Dad was faculty chair of the athletic council for 10 years. I confess that with all of Dad's accomplishments, the one I most enjoy casually mentioning is, you know, he hired Jim Valvano. Dad loved sports, and I loved loving sports with him. He loved playing. He was apparently a good handball player in his prime, and I heard a few times about the time at Teal where he beat the hot shot champion from West Point. I knew how to hit the ball so that he would have to dig it out of the radiator. Later we switched to tennis. Dad played at the faculty club, but he never entered the club tournaments or tried to pick up a game with a stranger. He only played with friends. That was part of the point. Sport was in part an expression of friendship, of love. But he always kept score. It wasn't so much that winning was important as trying to win. Every week he played Paul Breedenberg, and he never won a set. Not once. He could win some points and sometimes a game, but Dad would tell me Paul would simply bear down if his situation became precarious, and I would have held it against him if he didn't. Eventually his regulars aged out, and he insisted that his sons take their place. Dad beat me like a drum. It was years before he slowed enough that I could get a passing shot by him. I remember that he beat me on his 70th birthday. He teased me. If anyone asks me what I did for my 70th birthday, I'll say, well, in the morning I whipped my son in tennis. We played on his 80th birthday, too. He had stopped beating me by that point. I suppose I would bear down if my situation became precarious. And he would have held it against me if I hadn't. He was a fan, too. We rooted for the Pirates and the Steelers and Pete Sampras. The Brooklyn Dodgers were long gone. But mostly it was the Wolfpack. Dad loved NC State University. And I was in. I can still take myself to basketball season in 1972. I was 11 years old, and Dad would take us all to campus. He'd park in his usual spot at his office. There we were in his world. If it was a weeknight game, there'd be students walking to class. There was something almost solemn about the not quite ivy-covered walls. We'd walk through campus. I'd trot. Dad was a fast walker. And get to the tunnel under the train tracks. When we came out on the other side of the tunnel, there was a carnival. There was Reynolds Coliseum, and everyone was in red. I don't think the cheerleaders were really out front of the Coliseum, but that's how I remember it. Somehow the memory of this ritual is more vivid than the games themselves. To this day, every time I walk through that tunnel, I'm taken back to age 11, talking to Dad about David Thompson. I remember asking him early in that season how high the Pack did do in the rankings. He said, I think we could go all the way to number 2, behind UCLA. I was quite impressed when we ended that season at number 2. Here at the end, with his dementia having taken hold, I could still make Dad smile by recording how well the football team was doing, or the basketball team, or swimming, or wrestling. I wish I could tell him the baseball team was 28-3. He used to love to slip out of the office in the afternoon and catch a few innings. I love NC State University. Dad sent all 3 sons there naturally. Bob and Bill were philosophy majors. I majored in math. Well, if you have to specialize, he teased me. I would go by his office in the afternoon and we would just talk. Sometimes about Wolfpack sports, of course, but often about life and philosophy and ideas. I was in his world, and it was the closest we'd ever been. Sometimes he'd bring me home to eat Mom's food. I'd bring my laundry basket. I left Raleigh for 4 years after I graduated, but I was excited to come back when Bob told me about the job in registration and records. My tenure crossed with Dad's for a couple of years, so all 4 Bryan men were on campus at the same time. It's been 30 years since Dad retired, and I'm still at the university. Now I get to advise Hannah on her courses the way Dad did for me. I understand why people hold on so ferociously to a family farm. I feel honored that my little garden is right next to the one he tended all those years. I smile when I see where the institution is in 2019 because so much of it is what he could see back in 1966. And Dad loved NC State University.
Good morning. I was feeling so composed when I woke up, and then my brothers got up here, and now I'm all choked up. Shucks, how are you so composed up there? That was incredible. So remembering Dad, what can I say about my dad? He was my hero. He was my idol. He was my friend. I felt loved, unconditionally loved by my father. I always felt safe, protected. I felt accepted, eternally, always accepted. Even till the very end, my dad always smiled when I walked in the room. I knew that I was loved. I knew I was supported. I knew I was his top priority. And I knew that I had a wonderful man to model how to walk in the world. Because to me, my dad was larger than life. NC State was its own little world, and Dad loved it. And within those hollowed halls, my dad was a big deal. He was head of his department. So he had the corner office with the windows and a secretary and everything. He had become friends with some of the most influential people in the world. He was friends with Willis Casey. He was the athletic director at NC State, and his picture was at the beginning of every football and basketball program, so you knew he was a big deal. And Norm Sloan, head basketball coach of the top-ranked Wolfpack, had sat and drank a beer in our living room. I couldn't have been more impressed as a little 10-year-old boy if it had been the President of the United States. Norm Sloan sat in my living room. So I looked up to my dad. And so much of what my dad loved and valued and enjoyed still echoes in me. My dad loved the sunny, hot summer day. A long conversation while sitting by the shore in a comfortable beach chair. Well, it's just one of his favorite things to do. And I still believe there's no better way to spend a day. My dad loved sports. Everything about it. Playing them, watching them, talking endlessly about sports around the dinner table, reading about sports, writing about sports. There was something about sports that inspired him and spurred his imagination. It was the human condition and all its struggle and work and its victory and its loss wrapped up into one sunny afternoon that could be measured and honored and appreciated in a clear and satisfying way. And I still start every day with sports news programming. My dad loved music. Nothing like a perfectly sung 4-part harmony. He loved big band swing. And I'm sure he and his brother Wilbur are no doubt arguing right now over who was better, Benny Goodman or Jimmy Dorsey. Dad was right, of course, you can't beat Benny Goodman. I don't know if y'all know, but I own a few records. Just a little bit of vinyl. My dad loved a beautifully constructed sentence, a perfectly worded description, a crystal clear argument, an original premise that led to a perfectly logical and undeniable conclusion. My dad loved a good debate. Sometimes I take the other side of an argument, even when I don't believe it, just to have an argument. I love a good debate, too. My dad loved a clever play on words, a unique turn of phrase. He loved a good cartoon. He liked to laugh. I loved seeing with his brother Will because Will could always make my dad laugh. My dad loved good food, a good dance, good scotch, a good party. Never leave a party, he would say, because even a bad party might turn into a good party any second. My dad liked nice clothes. He loved to find the perfect tie for that new blue suit. I think as upset as I ever saw my dad was when he left his collection of silk ties at the Hyatt in Miami. He even called down there. I was in room 2115. They're hanging in the closet. Oh, yes, they said. We'll mail them to you. Yes, sir. 2 weeks later, this box of random-ass ugly ties pulled out with bright patterns and parrots and golfers. And that was a running joke for years. Oh, Dad, where's that parrot tie you love so much? You got perfectly with that suit. My dad loved Christmas. He loved giving presents and getting presents. He loved Christmas candy and Christmas music. He just loved the hustle and bustle of the season. And I still say Christmas is winter's only redeeming feature. But most of all, my dad loved being at home. He loved his wife. He loved his house on the hill with the hemlocks bursting green every spring. And he loved seeing his sons prosper and be happy. I was never the student that my dad was. But even through my struggles, he never gave up. Even when I dropped out of school, he said, "You'll get up every morning with me and drive into the university, and we'll have a little mini class, a little mini college course." And I read books like On the Road by Kuryakyn, and Sid Arthur by Hermann Hesse, and Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. And then I'd write papers, and he would grade them. How great is that? I remember after he read my paper on Sid Arthur, he said that was college-level analysis, and that I should aim for higher education, or I risk not reaching my potential. I can still hear those words. And I did go to state and earned a degree in philosophy. But you know, when my path took me down a more spiritual way of tarot cards and energy healing, my dad celebrated my accomplishments and reveled in knowing that I had found my life expression that made me feel in perfect rhythm with my gifts and my truths, which is what makes life so rich and satisfying. And after all, that's all those philosophies are trying to get to, the best and most joyful life that the human condition can offer. My dad loved reason and well-considered arguments, spirited debate on issues of social justice and ethical human behavior. But he understood that it's really most beautiful when it sets into action that which is kind and generous and loving. My agnostic father once told me as we stood at the top of our driveway with the sun shining down on us, he said, "There's something special about love. And now you dwell in that love, Dad. Love and light as big as your heart. I love you always." Thank you.
I'm trying to tell you something about my life. Maybe give me insight between black and white. And the best thing you've ever done for me is to help me take my life less seriously. It's only life after all. Though darkness has a hunger that's insatiable, and lightness has a call that's hard to hear, I wrap my fear around me like a blanket. I sail my ship of safety till I sink it. I'm crawling on your shore. I went to the doctor, I went to the mountains, I looked to the children, I drank from the fountain. There's more than one answer to these questions, pointing me in a crooked line. And the less I seek my source for some definitives, closer
We'd like to invite anyone who has a memory of Dad that they'd like to share to do so at this time. You're welcome to come forward.
I'm Jim Smith, and I was at NC State starting in '67, so I came just a year after your dad, I believe. And I was in engineering at the time, and I had to take some of those liberal arts courses. And so I didn't know any better, and I signed up for Introduction to Philosophy with Dr. Bryan. You know, I can't remember a lot of my professors from NC State. A lot of them, they just kind of came and went. But I do remember Bob Bryan. And there are a couple of things in that class that I want to just tell you about quickly. Sherwood, I was in that class with Tommy Burleson. And I remember every day when he came into class, he had to kind of go like that to get through the door. And I remember reading Plato's Republic and talking about justice and about form versus whatever the other part of it is. But those were things that really touched me deeply. But I think the thing I remember most is the twinkle in his eye. He just had the most wonderful twinkle when he got tickled about something. And so it meant a lot to me, and I have, every time I would see him, which wasn't often, but I would sometimes see him with Geraldine, it was just a pleasure to see him and remember those times again. So thank you all.
I too, after only a first few classes of that fall 1966 ethics course, insisted to my friends that they too had to take a Dr. Bryan course. I went on to take 2 senior seminars from him and was honored when he asked me to assist in his Introduction to Philosophy course my final semester at State. That would have been 67, 68. And maybe I was insisting in that course. He encouraged me to go on to graduate school, and I eventually obtained a PhD in philosophy from Ohio State. Dr. Bryan inscribed my personal copy of his book, A Life Worth Living, with the words, "I hope that this is at heart of what made a difference to you." Indeed, it does. He ends that wonderful little book with a famous quote from Nietzsche, "Keep holy your highest hope." I'm sure he knew that Nietzsche would treasure all his life. This line from Pindar, "Become what you are," having learned what that is, I learned from Dr. Bryan, both in the seminar room and by his example, what I was to become. That is, how to lead an honorable and worthwhile life. And for that, I will be forever grateful and thankful. Let it be noted.
Hello, my name is Tony Lee, and I've had the honor to be an honorary member of the Bryan family. At least I think so. They may disagree. I have. But,
What's your name?
But what I wanted to share was 3 quick Bob stories. So the first one is, and when I was about 21 or 22, I had dropped out of college twice. And I was attempting to go to college over down there in Chapel Hill, which I know Bob didn't approve of, but he didn't judge me. And I had gone on a long trip and come back. It was the last week of August, and classes had already started at State. And I gravitated to the Bryan's house, as I always did, and so I ended up talking to Bob out in the driveway. And Bob says, "So what are you going to do?" And I said, "I have no idea. I have no idea." Because at that point I really didn't. I'd been working while I was out of college, and I had been entertaining going back, but having dropped out twice, that didn't really seem like maybe the greatest idea. But so Bob said, "Have you thought about going to state?" And I said, "Not really." Because I was an arts guy, right? I wanted to go to a place that I felt had better arts. And he said, "Well, why don't you," he said, "Hold on a minute." He went inside and he got a bulletin, right, which is the catalog of courses. He brought me the catalog and he said, "Why don't you look at that and see if anything interests you? And if it does, we'll talk about it." And I was like, "Okay, but the class has started already." And, you know, Bob says, only Bob can, "I know some people." Which brings me to my second story, which is about Bob as a teacher. Because Bob, I had been hearing about this ethics class around the dinner table for, 15 years, since I moved to Raleigh in '74, and met Billy in Sherwood, and ended up, at a lot of dinners and a lot of functions at the house. And of course, ethics and philosophy was a big topic there. So at any rate, when I was looking at the bulletin, trying to decide what I was going to do, I found the ethics class, and I thought, well, now that interests me. And there were other things that interested me too, but that was one of them, was the opportunity to take that class. So Bob got me into class, and I sat through that class, and I would read the material, right? And philosophy is not the easiest subject. And for those of you who don't know what I mean, try reading a little Immanuel Kant. Because I would read it and it would be gobbledygook. I mean, I would just not be able to process that information. And yet, when I sat in his class, I got it. I mean, he told it in a way that just, I osmosed it in, right? And I don't think I just certainly have never had a teacher whose teaching did that to me, where I basically learned it by absorbing it from him talking about it. And in fact, the first test we had, I was scared to death because I was just sure I was going to fail this thing miserably, because, I couldn't really parrot back the things that were in the works that I'd read. So at any rate, but I took the first test and I got an A. And I was like, he's a good teacher. And he really is. I've never met anybody that could teach so effortlessly or make it look effortlessly when I know it was anything but. But so, best teacher I ever had, easily. And then the last thing I want to say is he also had the most devastating comeback, right? Because if he asked you a question and you said something he either didn't agree with or didn't like, then he would say, as only Bob could, "Fine."
My name is Tom Wentworth, and I was one of Bob's colleagues for many years. I didn't bring notes, but I wanted to go back and talk about Bob as a builder of NC State University. And this will come full circle with some of the other things we've discussed. This is a story about Phi Beta Kappa, which is the most prestigious and oldest honor organization, student honor organization in the United States. There are a lot of imitators, but there's only one Phi Beta Kappa. And they're pretty snooty. Even today, only 10% of universities and colleges in the United States have made the bar to qualify to host a chapter of Phi Beta Kappa, which enables them to then recognize outstanding students with that designation. So when I came here in 1976, right behind the ears, young assistant professor, one of the first things that happened was I was appointed to a committee to apply for a chapter of Phi Beta Kappa, chaired by Bob Bryan. And I guess I'd been identified because I was Phi Beta Kappa at Dartmouth. So you have to remember that NC State had rather humble beginnings as largely an agricultural and engineering university. Cow College, right? State University. And we really weren't what Phi Beta Kappa was looking for in our earlier days. We focused on the liberal arts and sciences. They really don't care if you have a good engineering school, because that's applied. And Bob thought that NC State could grow and become a fine university in every sense of the word that could have excellence in the liberal arts and sciences. And so he gathered a committee, the one I joined. I think they'd already applied once. This happened on a triennial basis. Put together an application that was, if any of you remember phone books, right? About that thick, like a telephone book. And then the august committees at Phi Beta Kappa would evaluate these. And, you know, eventually you'd get a visit, and if you made the cut, then you become part of the club. Well, we applied, and we applied. Every 3 years, Bob drove that committee. We always had to fix something. One year it was the libraries. And as we heard, Bob knew people. And so there was a big effort to upgrade the libraries. And there were other efforts to upgrade music and arts and all the liberal sciences. And each year we got a little closer. And finally, I believe it was in 1986, we had made the cut. The Committee on Admissions said, no problem, you're in. And their triennial meeting, where the final vote occurs, was in Washington, D.C. that year. It was so certain that they told Bob to come to accept our induction into the organization. And at that meeting, the representative from Duke University stood up and said, I don't think NC State should be brought into this organization. We had just had a little kerfuffle with a football player who had stolen something, no, basketball player, excuse me, name will go unmentioned. He'd stolen something, and then in the process it had come out that he was nowhere at all qualified to be at NC State University. And so the big scandal, it just hit the newspapers, and the guy from Duke said, I don't think this university merits membership in Phi Beta Kappa. And so Bob watched as they voted us down. A done deal. And that broke his heart. We sat out, we sat out for 3 years, nursed our wounds. And then a newly formed committee got together, applied again. Bob wasn't the chair then, but certainly cheering for us. And of course, we sailed through with flying colors. And at that special meeting, the same guy from Duke stood up and said, what a wonderful place we were, and what amazing programs we had in the liberal arts and sciences, and how worthy we were of having a chapter. And so in 1992, we began our chapter, over 25 years old now, and really it's all because Bob had that vision that NC State could be better, could be more fully rounded. And he fought for that, and it happened. And so just another way that he built this fine university. So, thank you.
I'm Jim Coleman from Asheville. And Jim, I got to where you are the same way, engineering philosophy. then I took another degree in economics and became a banker. So there you are. I think without Dr. Bryan, my wife Helen and I would have not married. We were both students. I was in engineering, she was in English, taking a course in philosophy under Dr. Bryan. She recommended that I attend. The attraction was her. She stayed in engineering, she stayed in English. I went on to philosophy. And she would be here today, but she's recovering from an injury, so she sends her best. Sometimes people ask, what did I study? I'll say philosophy, and then what can you use it for? Where does it go? There's been some discussion here today, thankfully, of NC State and sports. So let me give you a personal story to show you just how far philosophy can reach at unusual times. I was refereeing a football game for the Atlantic Coast Conference. It was in Columbia, South Carolina. It was South Carolina versus Clemson. Not a small occasion to those. After a touchdown play by Clemson, I was headed up the sideline because it was my responsibility to deliver the ball to where they were going. For those of you who don't know football, I apologize, but the ball would be kicked off from the 40-yard line then, and it was my responsibility to take the ball up there. It's about a 60-yard walk. There's television, so you've got plenty of time to do it. And as I left the goalpost to go to the corner pylon to walk up with the football, an assistant coach met me at about the 10-yard line. He was out of his box. He shouldn't have been there. But he was upset about something that I had nothing to do with. It happened way on the other side of the field. I had no idea what he was talking. And he was about that high off the ground with his anger. He's an assistant football coach, so I said, I'll ignore him. The head football coach, by the way, was Lou Holtz. As I moved up the sideline, my normal pace, he kept coming behind me. And finally we got up to about halfway and he said, hey, you're not going to listen to me, are you? It wasn't until then that I thought about the philosophy of the matter. To me, it was a classic case of free will versus determinism. He was determined, but I had control. So I did stop, at which point he stopped and looked me in the eye, still angry, about what I didn't know, but he takes out a stick of gum and he sticks it in his mouth and he leans forward. This was the critical moment. What was I going to do? Philosophically speaking, I knew what it was immediately. I turned, I looked at him and I said, what kind of gum is that? I did it. I headed up the sideline and he was dead in his tracks. But Lou Holtz was really the one that I was interested in, but he did not get involved in this conversation. At that point in time, we're about ready to go to the kickoff, if you remember. And in order for that to happen, the referee has to make sure all of his officials are awake and alert to what's getting ready to happen. So Ron Cherry was the official then, if some of you know that name. I would say something about Ron, but I had a better time. So Ron first points to me, which was the standard. He was standing 70 yards away in the end zone. He would point, I would raise my hand. I'm ready. So he would go around the horn, which took a little bit of time. So there I was, standing, waiting for him to blow the whistle and go. And I felt a tug at my pants pocket. And the kick came, and it came to my side. So here I have responsibility for the ball. And the ball changed, and the ball gets out there, and South Carolina now has the ball. And I thought to myself, what was that? And I reached in my pocket and pulled out a stick of T-berry gum. I'm not sure who won that debate, but I still have the gum. I learned a great deal about life and sports and fairness and morality from Dr. Bryan. And I do appreciate that. And I have a great wife as a result.
I just want to mention that Bob and Geraldine were big ballroom dancers. Who would know? And I don't know how many years you did ballroom dancing, but I remember at one time, Geraldine was sitting at it because all these women kept asking Bob to dance. That may have kind of ended the ballroom dancing.
Anyone else? Thank you for all those remarks. Dad would like to have the last word. So he prepared this, and I'll try to give it voice. A little sad that, alas, it's all over. It went so fast. There was so much more we wanted to do. We loved it, loved innumerable things and special people in it, yet couldn't hold on to it. Finally, we did get old, a mixed blessing, and of course, we hope to die easy. Suitably humble, since the universe could have done without us. We were such an insignificant part, serving no universal purpose. But that's all right. It's a very big universe, itself serving no perceptible purpose. Somewhat awed by it all, we know so little when it comes down to it. Even in our small domain, we just try as well as we can to keep up even superficially, having to live with esoteric theories across the entire arena of thought, and especially with the surge of science and technology. For what it's worth and what it tells you, my life has been Twitter and text free. With all, we might not even be able to understand what future generations are talking about. A little embarrassed, we were often so foolish. A little embarrassment, however, is just about right. We need not be humiliated by our follies. We are not a constant self, always in the same mood, always with the same desires and impulses. It just happens that way, given our brains and nervous systems. And it would have been unbearable to be solemn all the time. Appropriately penitent at the end, nevertheless, in spite of what we might have wished to be morally, we have, from early on and over the course of active searching lives, inevitably failed. There were the self-serving acts, the protection of our interests, the unwillingness to sacrifice. There were, moreover, the conflicts where harm could not have been avoided, or where the adventure of our lives we could not deny. We're not talking about base lying, cheating, and stealing. We're talking about a reasonably fulfilled and decent human life, a life animated by vivid imagination of the lives of others. So at the end, we should be penitent, but not obsessively. All things considered, we can number ourselves among the good guys and be properly deferential. Nostalgia is a nice sentiment. Replay the good times, the good people, the moments when life was at its best. We were reminded of the preciousness and uniqueness of our own lives. Leave the bad times behind. Finally, grateful and content. If at the end we have been even moderately fortunate and have lived about as well as we can reasonably be expected of us, then we must be immensely grateful and justifiably content. Life is an end in itself, there to be lived, if it has not been beset by tragedy. I know some lives have been ravaged by tragedy. Some lives, many lives, all over the world have been rendered destitute by conditions and events beyond their possessors' poor powers to control. For them we must weep, but not incessantly. It is not heartless not to grieve incessantly. But if we are among the blessed and the meaning of our lives has not been gutted by failure and misfortune, then it would be obscene not to be grateful, and I am grateful. By sheer good fortune, I was allowed to make my living engaged in activities that satisfied my urge for autonomy, my modest feats of ingenuity and invention, for zest and vitality. I came to know a lot of good people. I've had something to eat come mealtime and a warm place to sleep at night. People I have loved me. I've been given to believe that my life has been a benefit not just to myself. As I look back on it, my perception is that for all its unadvertised flaws and within my limited ability to achieve it, my life has been optimistic, purposeful, and not altogether lacking in passion. In any case, I certainly have enjoyed it. And thank you, dear ones, who have been a necessary condition to my joy. I'd like to say a special thanks to the church for making this such a special occasion for us, making it so easy for us. Thank you all. And now, if you'd like to join us in the Long Wing for some refreshments and conversation, we'd be pleased to host.